The rain poured down in heavy sheets, drenching the darkened roadside. Ethan Carter, a struggling mechanic barely scraping by, pulled over when he saw a woman standing beside a sleek black Bentley, her hands trembling as she stared at a completely shredded tire. He had no idea that stopping to help her would change his life forever. He didn't know that the woman, drenched, shivering, and far from home, was worth billions. He also didn't know that, in a world where money could buy anything, she was looking for the one thing it couldn't, someone who would love her for who she truly was. But as their worlds collide, a single question lingers. Would she trust her heart with a man who had nothing? Or would her fear of being used destroy the one chance at true love she'd ever had? Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain hammered against the cracked windshield of Ethan Carter's rusted pickup, the wipers barely keeping up with the downpour. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road stretching ahead. It was late, too late to still be out driving after a 12-hour shift at the shop. But he had bills to pay, and staying late meant keeping the lights on for one more month. The wind howled through the trees, and just as he rounded a bend, he spotted it. A sleek black Bentley parked awkwardly on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing like a distress signal against the storm. A figure stood beside it, barely visible through the sheets of rain, pacing back and forth. Ethan didn't need to see the details to know one thing for sure. Whoever owned that car didn't belong in a place like this. Rich people never stopped in towns like his. They sped through, on their way to better places, never sparing a glance for the ones who barely got by. He had half a mind to keep driving. It wasn't his problem. But then he caught a glimpse of her, just for a second, in the glow of his headlights, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, soaked to the bone, her posture stiff with frustration. With a heavy sigh, Ethan eased his truck onto the shoulder and killed the engine. Stepping out, the cold rain hit him like a slap. His work boots splashed against the flooded pavement as he made his way over. "Need a hand?" he called out over the storm. The woman turned, and even through the rain, he could see the sharp elegance in her features, high cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, a tailored coat that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Everything about her screamed privilege. But right now, she was just another stranded driver on a deserted road in the middle of a storm. Her lips parted slightly as she looked at him, surprise flickering across her face, as if she hadn't expected anyone to stop. "The tire's blown," she said, her voice clipped, controlled, "and my roadside assistance is apparently useless." Ethan huffed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Figures. You got a spare?" She gestured toward the car. "I think so." "You think?" He smirked despite himself. "You don't change a lot of tires, do you?" Something in her expression shifted, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Not personally, no." Ethan shook his head, walking past her. "Pop the trunk." She hesitated just for a second, as if debating whether or not she trusted him. Then, with a resigned sigh, she turned and did as he asked. The trunk opened with a smooth click, revealing a perfectly untouched spare and a set of tools that looked like they had never been used. Ethan let out a low whistle. "Well, at least you're prepared." "I make a habit of it," she said, crossing her arms as she stood just out of the rain under the slight cover of her car door. Ethan crouched beside the car, water pooling beneath him as he got to work. The bolts were stiff, figured. Fancy cars always had complications. He glanced up at her between turns of the wrench. "You passing through or something?" She hesitated before answering. "Something like that?" Vague. He didn't press. Not his business. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and the occasional muttered curse from Ethan as he wrestled with the stubborn lug nuts. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but he worked quickly, moving on muscle memory alone. When the last bolt was tightened, he stood, wiping his wet hands on his jeans. "All set," he said, stepping back. "You're good to go." She exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Thank you." Ethan nodded, already turning to leave when she reached into her coat and pulled out a sleek, black wallet. "Let me pay you." He stopped, glancing at the wallet, then back at her. The offer was expected. It wasn't like people like her were used to favors without a price tag attached. But something about the way she said it, carefully, deliberately, rubbed him the wrong way. "Nah," he said, shaking his head. "Just glad you're safe." She frowned, clearly caught off guard. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," he said, stepping away. "Drive safe." And just like that, he walked back toward his truck, not waiting for a response. He didn't need her money. He wasn't some charity case. But as he climbed into the driver's seat and pulled back onto the road, he caught one last glimpse of her in his rearview mirror, standing there watching him, like she wasn't used to people saying no. He didn't know it then, but that night, in the middle of a rainstorm, something had shifted, and it was only the beginning. Ethan crouched down beside the Bentley, his fingers already numb from the freezing rain. Water dripped from his soaked flannel, the cold seeping into his bones, but he barely noticed. Years of working in drafty garages and oil-slicked floors had taught him to ignore discomfort. What mattered was getting the job done. Alexandra stood just outside the reach of the downpour, arms crossed tightly, shifting from one foot to the other. She glanced at him, then at the rain hammering against the asphalt, then back at him. "You really don't have to do this," she said, her voice carrying an edge of hesitation. "I can wait for roadside assistance." Ethan scoffed, working the lug wrench over a rusted bolt. "Yeah? And how long did they say it'd take?" She exhaled sharply. "An hour." He shot her a look, rain dripping from his lashes. "You planning on standing out here the whole time?" She hesitated, her jaw tightening. He had a point. Still, people like him, strangers, men especially, always wanted something in return. Money, favors, a way to make her feel like she owed them. But this man, kneeling in the pouring rain, soaking wet and working without complaint, hadn't asked for a damn thing. Ethan could feel her eyes on him as he loosened the last stubborn bolt. She was waiting for him to name his price. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now. He paused, gripping the tire iron before glancing up at her again. Water streamed down his face, but his expression was unreadable. "Because you needed help." A simple answer, too simple. She studied him, searching for the angle. "Most people wouldn't stop," she said carefully, "and the ones who do usually expect something in return." Ethan shook his head, letting out a breath that curled into the cold air. "Guess I'm not most people." Something in her expression faltered, just for a second. A flash of something he couldn't quite place. She looked away. "You should at least let me pay you." Ethan exhaled sharply, twisting the final bolt loose. "You keep saying that, like my time's worth more than yours." She blinked, caught off guard. Ethan pulled the ruined tire free, tossing it to the side before grabbing the spare. He worked quickly, efficiently, his fingers moving over the wheel with the kind of practiced ease that only came from years of doing this exact same thing, except never for a woman in a tailored coat whose perfume still lingered faintly even in the rain. Alexandra watched him, arms still folded, as if she was trying to make sense of the moment. He wasn't flirting. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't asking for anything, and that was what unsettled her the most. Ethan tightened the last bolt and gave the tire a firm push, making sure it was secure. "All right," he said, standing up and wiping his wet hands against his jeans. "You're good to go." She hesitated again, as if searching for the right words. "Thank you," she said finally. He nodded, stepping back. "Drive safe." And just like that, he turned and walked back toward his truck. No lingering glance, no second thought. Alexandra stood frozen for a moment, watching his retreating figure. People didn't walk away from her. They didn't just help and leave. That wasn't how things worked in her world. As she slid back into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with cold fingers, she found herself staring at him through the rain-streaked windshield. She didn't even know his name. But she knew this wouldn't be the last time she saw him. Rain hammered against the windshield as Alexandra sat behind the wheel, her hand still gripping the steering wheel long after she should have driven away. The engine hummed softly, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside, but her mind was fixated on something else. Someone else. She glanced at her rearview mirror, catching sight of the man walking back to his rusted truck, shoulders hunched against the cold, his soaked flannel clinging to him. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He had done what he came to do and left, just like that. No expectation, no ulterior motive. That wasn't how the world worked. At least, not in her world. Throwing the car into park, she reached for her purse, her fingers brushing against the crisp $100 bills tucked inside. She pulled one free, hesitated, then grabbed another. It wasn't much, not for her at least. A fraction of what she spent on a single dinner, a pair of shoes, a meaningless transaction in a life full of them. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. Wait! Ethan was already at his truck, shaking water from his hair when he turned. His expression was unreadable as she hurried toward him, rain pelting against her skin. She held out the bills. Please, take it. He didn't move, didn't reach for the money. You don't owe me anything, he said evenly. She blinked, water dripping from her lashes. It's not about owing you. It's about fairness. You helped me, and I didn't ask for anything in return, he cut in, his voice steady but firm. I don't need your money. The words stung more than she expected, not because of the rejection, but because they were so foreign. People always took what she offered. Always. Her fingers curled around the cash as she let her arm drop to her side. I don't understand you, she admitted. Ethan huffed a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Not much to understand, he said. I saw someone who needed help. That's it. That was it? Just like that? She searched his face for something, some hint that he was lying, that he was playing some long game, that at any moment he'd let the mask slip and reveal what he really wanted from her. But all she saw was quiet certainty. He wasn't faking it. She swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. At least tell me your name. He studied her for a moment, then exhaled. Ethan. She nodded, tucking the name away like it meant something. I'm Alexandra. I figured, he said, tilting his head toward the car. A Bentley in the middle of nowhere? You don't exactly blend in. A small, surprised laugh escaped her, but before she could say anything else, he was already turning toward his truck. Conversation over. Alexandra stood there for a beat longer, the rain soaking through her coat, watching as he climbed inside. A moment later, his headlights flickered on, cutting through the storm. She forced herself to move, to slide back into the warmth of her own car. But as she gripped the wheel, staring at the empty space where he had just been, she felt something shift inside her. She had met 1,000 men in her life, businessmen, socialites, politicians, men who said all the right things, who smiled in all the right places, who knew exactly how to maneuver their way into her life with practiced charm and well-placed compliments. But this man, Ethan, was different. And as she pulled onto the road and watched his taillights disappear in the opposite direction, she realized something unsettling. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to know more. Ethan pushed open the door to his tiny apartment, the hinges creaking in protest. The place smelled like motor oil and damp wood, the remnants of a leaky roof he hadn't quite gotten around to fixing. A single lamp cast a dull glow over the cluttered space. Unpaid bills stacked on the counter, an old coffee mug half full with yesterday's brew, a small TV that only worked when you smacked it just right. He dropped his keys onto the table and ran a hand through his damp hair. His boots left muddy footprints across the worn-out floor, but he didn't have the energy to care. His body ached from the long shift at the shop, from kneeling in the cold rain to change a stranger's tire, from carrying the weight of too many problems and not enough solutions. The envelope on the table caught his eye. Final notice. His stomach twisted. He already knew what it said without opening it. 2 weeks. That's what the landlord had given him last time, maybe less now. He exhaled sharply and dropped onto the couch, the springs groaning under his weight. He'd figure something out. He always did. But the truth was, he was tired. Tired of scraping by. Tired of always being a step behind. Tired of knowing that no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough. And then there was her. Alexandra. The name rolled around in his head, foreign but familiar. She was probably sitting in some $1,000,000 apartment right now, dry, warm, untouched by the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into his bones. A woman like that, polished, untouchable, had no idea what it felt like to stare at eviction notices or wonder if her next meal would come from a $1 menu. He scoffed to himself, shaking his head. It was stupid to even think about her, but he did. Across the city, Alexandra stepped into her penthouse, greeted by silence. The space was immaculate, all glass and chrome, sleek furniture, and curated perfection. A panoramic view of the skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittering like a million little promises. But it didn't feel like home. It never had. She slipped off her wet coat, draping it over the back of a chair before making her way to the kitchen. Her fingers moved on autopilot, pouring a glass of wine, setting it beside a barely touched plate of catered food from earlier that day. Her phone buzzed. A message from David. Meeting confirmed for tomorrow. Let's close the deal. She stared at the words, unreadable and impersonal, like every other text she received. This was her life. Meetings, negotiations, endless business deals that added numbers to her bank account, but nothing to her soul. Everyone who walked through her doors wanted something. Money, contracts, opportunities. Even the men she dated, the ones who smiled charmingly across five-star dinners, who told her all the right things, none of them had ever looked at her the way Ethan had. Not with expectation, not with calculation. Just curiosity. She took a sip of wine, but it tasted empty. Everything did. Her mind drifted back to the way he had stood in the rain, unfazed by who she was, unimpressed by the world she came from. He had refused her money. That was something she still couldn't wrap her head around. People didn't refuse her. And yet, here she was, staring at her reflection in the darkened window, wondering why it mattered so damn much. Why, in a life full of polished perfection, she suddenly felt like something was missing. Alexandra sat at the head of a long conference table, her hands folded neatly, her expression composed. The boardroom was filled with the usual voices, executives throwing around figures, analysts discussing market trends, but she wasn't listening. She was supposed to be leading this meeting, setting the direction for the next quarter, but her mind was elsewhere. Ethan. She hadn't spoken his name aloud, hadn't even allowed herself to dwell on him for too long, and yet, no matter how much she tried to push him aside, the image of him standing in the rain, refusing her money, refusing her, was burned into her thoughts. Miss Whitmore? She blinked, realizing too late that the room had gone silent. Every pair of eyes was on her, waiting. She exhaled slowly and straightened in her chair. "We'll revisit the proposal next week," she said coolly, already standing. "I have other matters to attend to." There was no argument. There never was. When Alexandra Whitmore left a room, people adjusted accordingly. She strode down the hallway, her heels clicking against the polished marble, before pushing open the door to her assistant's office. Olivia looked up, startled, mid-typing. "Find someone for me," Alexandra said, not bothering with pleasantries. Olivia straightened. "Of course. Who?" She hesitated. Who was he, really? A mechanic? A good Samaritan? A man who didn't seem to fit into her world at all? "His name is Ethan," she said finally. "I don't have a last name." Olivia reached for her notepad. "Where did you meet him?" "Outside of town," Alexandra said, crossing her arms. "He drives an old pickup. He works as a mechanic, but not at a dealership. A small shop somewhere local." Olivia frowned. "You want me to look into a random mechanic?" Alexandra's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Yes." A pause. "May I ask why?" She had no real answer, nothing that made sense, nothing she could explain, not to Olivia, not to herself. "I just need to know more," she said simply. Olivia didn't press further. She never did. "I'll get back to you," she said, already typing. Alexandra nodded, turning to leave. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more. But as she stepped back into the quiet of her office, staring out over the city skyline, she couldn't ignore the truth simmering beneath the surface. Ethan had gotten under her skin, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what to do about it. The sharp scent of motor oil and steel filled the garage, mingling with the steady hum of a drill from the back. Ethan wiped his hands on an old rag, his skin already stained with grease from the third repair job of the morning. Business was slow, as usual, but that wasn't anything new. Small-town folks came in when they had to, not because they wanted to. He was tightening the last bolt on an old Chevy's engine when the sound of unfamiliar tires crunching over gravel made him pause. Luxury cars didn't belong here. Not in a place where most of the trucks had rust creeping up their sides and where half the customers still paid in crumpled bills. He straightened, glancing toward the entrance just in time to see the sleek black Bentley roll to a stop outside. The door opened, and out she stepped. Ethan froze. Alexandra Whitmore. For a second, he thought he was imagining things. He had convinced himself she was nothing more than a fleeting moment in his life. Someone from another world, someone he would never see again. Yet here she was, stepping onto his cracked pavement in designer heels and an expensive coat that looked as out of place as she did. She hesitated only for a second before walking toward him, her gaze locked onto his. Ethan exhaled slowly, wiping his hands once more, though it did nothing to clean them. "Something wrong with your car again?" Her lips quirked slightly, but there was something unreadable in her expression. "No, not this time." She glanced around the garage, taking in the old equipment, the dim fluorescent lights, the stacks of tires leaning against the wall. It wasn't the kind of place someone like her belonged. Ethan crossed his arms. "Then why are you here?" She didn't flinch at his directness. If anything, she seemed to expect it. "I want to hire you," she said. A muscle in his jaw ticked. "For what?" Alexandra tilted her head slightly, studying him. "A job, a real one. And this time, I'll pay you for it." Something inside Ethan bristled. "You tracked me down for that?" She took a breath, steady and measured. "I wouldn't call it tracking. I needed a mechanic, and I know a good one when I see one." His eyes narrowed. "You don't know me." She held his gaze. "Maybe not, but I'd like to." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Ethan had met a lot of people in his life, customers, drifters, strangers who passed through town and never looked back. But none of them had ever looked at him the way Alexandra was looking at him now, like she was waiting for him to prove something. Or maybe like she already knew he would. He glanced at the Bentley again, at the gleaming emblem that screamed money, privilege, a life he had never been a part of. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head. "You're serious about this?" Her lips parted slightly, a flicker of something in her eyes, determination maybe, or something else entirely. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't—" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, still trying to wrap his head around it. Something told him this wasn't just about a job, and that was the part that worried him the most. Ethan leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, the scent of motor oil thick in the air. His gaze remained fixed on Alexandra, who stood in the middle of his garage, like she had every right to be there. The contrast was almost laughable. Her perfectly tailored coat, the delicate gold bracelet on her wrist, the subtle scent of something expensive lingering between them. Everything about her screamed privilege. A life lived far from places like this, and yet she was here. "You're going to have to help me understand something," he said finally, his voice steady but laced with skepticism. Alexandra arched an eyebrow. "And what's that?" He pushed off the workbench, taking a slow step toward her. You. You show up at my garage after I already told you I don't need your money, and now you're offering me a job?" He let the words hang between them before shaking his head. "People like you don't just do things out of the goodness of their heart. So tell me, what's the catch?" Something flickered in her expression just for a second before she masked it with a smooth smile. "Not everything has a catch, Ethan." He let out a short laugh, sharp and disbelieving. "Right. And I'm supposed to just take your word for it?" She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "You have trust issues." "Yeah, well," he muttered, wiping his hands on a rag, "rich people have a habit of making that necessary." She should have been offended. He was waiting for it, for the indignation, for the practiced, clipped response of someone who wasn't used to being questioned. But instead, Alexandra just studied him, something like amusement dancing in her eyes. "I'm not like most rich people," Ethan scoffed. "Sure, you're different." Her lips twitched. "Maybe." That made him pause. She wasn't rattled, not even a little, and for some reason, that got under his skin more than if she'd snapped at him. "Let me guess," he said, crossing his arms again. "You're some kind of real estate investor, trust fund baby, or do you just make a habit of driving around in overpriced cars and hiring random mechanics?" Alexandra smirked, but there was something guarded in her expression now. "Let's just say I run a business." He frowned at that. It was vague, purposefully so. "What kind of business?" She held his gaze. "The successful kind." He huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, that's what I thought." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant clanking of tools from the back of the shop, the occasional drip of rainwater from a leak in the roof. Ethan should have walked away. He should have told her he wasn't interested, that whatever game she was playing, he wasn't biting. But the way she was looking at him, like she wasn't used to being doubted, like she didn't quite know what to do with someone who wasn't impressed by her, made him hesitate. Finally, she sighed. "I'm offering you an opportunity, Ethan, a real one. Whether you take it or not is up to you." Her voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it, something that didn't quite fit the polished, untouchable persona she wore so well. For the first time, Ethan wondered if she had walls just as thick as his own. He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "I don't trust you," he admitted. Alexandra nodded, unfazed. "Then let me change that." He didn't know why, but those words sent a slow heat curling through his chest. Something dangerous, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. And yet, he didn't tell her no. And that was the part that scared him the most. Alexandra hadn't planned to stay long. She told herself she was just here to make an offer, to see if Ethan would accept. But now, leaning against the hood of her Bentley, arms crossed as she watched him work, she couldn't seem to leave. Ethan was currently bent over the engine of a battered old station wagon, sleeves rolled up, forearms streaked with grease. The woman standing beside him was older, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun, her frail hands gripping a worn-out purse. She looked anxious, wringing her fingers as she spoke. "I can pay you next week, Ethan. You don't have to pay me, Mrs. Torres," he interrupted, tightening something under the hood. "It's just a busted alternator. Should be good to go in a few minutes." The woman shook her head, her eyes filled with quiet embarrassment. "I don't like charity. You know that." "And I don't like seeing you stranded on the side of the road," Ethan countered without looking up. Mrs. Torres sighed, but there was warmth in her expression. "Your mama raised you right, boy." Ethan smirked. "Don't let her hear you say that. She'll think she can still boss me around." Alexandra barely breathed as she watched the exchange. This wasn't an act. There was no audience to impress, no cameras, no one to witness it but her. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he wanted to. She had spent her whole life surrounded by people who measured kindness in transactions, who only helped when there was something to gain. But Ethan, he just helped. No hesitation, no conditions. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something shift inside her. Mrs. Torres patted Ethan's arm, murmuring a heartfelt thank you before sliding into her car. The engine rumbled to life, and she gave him a small wave before pulling out of the lot. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, finally glancing in Alexandra's direction. "You planning on standing there all day?" She tilted her head, studying him in a way that made his smirk falter. "You didn't even think about taking her money," she said, more to herself than to him. Ethan frowned. "Why would I?" Alexandra didn't answer, because the truth was she didn't know a single person in her world who would have done the same. And that realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Ethan had no business being here. That much was obvious the second he stepped into the restaurant. The place screamed wealth. Polished marble floors, towering crystal chandeliers, and the kind of hushed, reverent atmosphere that only existed in places where dinner cost more than his rent. The servers moved like ghosts, gliding between tables with silent efficiency, dressed in crisp black suits that probably cost more than the tools in his entire shop. He tugged at the collar of his button-down, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place he looked. He had borrowed the shirt from his friend Rick, the only guy he knew with anything remotely nice in his closet, but it still didn't fit right. Too stiff, too clean. He felt like an imposter. And then there was Alexandra. She was already seated at the corner table, a glass of wine in her hand, poised and effortless. The dim lighting caught the smooth elegance of her cheekbones, the glint of something expensive at her wrist. The moment she spotted him, her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile, like she had expected this reaction, like she knew exactly how much this place would rattle him. "Didn't think you'd show," she said, as he slid into the chair across from her. "Neither did I," Ethan muttered, glancing around. "Hell of a place for a thank-you dinner." Alexandra arched a brow. "Would you have preferred a burger joint?" "Honestly?" He exhaled. "Yeah." Her smirk deepened. "I'll keep that in mind for next time." Next time. The words sat between them, heavy with implications he wasn't sure how to unpack. A server appeared, placing a menu in front of him. Ethan barely glanced at it before shutting it again. There were no prices listed. Never a good sign. "You pick," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I don't speak fancy food." Alexandra looked amused, but didn't argue. A few words to the waiter, a knowing glance exchanged, and just like that, his fate was sealed. He folded his arms, studying her. "So this is your world, huh?" She held his gaze. "Surprised?" Ethan let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Not surprised. Just didn't realize how wide the gap was." Alexandra tilted her head slightly. "Does it bother you?" "Should it?" She hesitated, something flickering in her expression, something guarded. "It bothers some people," Ethan scoffed. "Yeah, well, I'm not most people." Her lips parted slightly, as if his answer had caught her off guard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of low conversation filled the space around them, glasses clinking, the distant sound of a piano playing somewhere in the background. Finally, Alexandra leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table. "So, tell me something," she said, her voice quieter now. "Why did you help me that night?" Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "You didn't know who I was? You didn't ask for anything in return?" Her gaze searched his face. "Why stop at all?" he shrugged. "Because you needed help." "That simple?" "Yeah." He exhaled. "Not everything has to be complicated, you know." Alexandra looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, Ethan saw something behind the practiced confidence, something softer, something uncertain. Maybe in her world, things weren't so simple. Maybe that's what scared her the most. The moment they stepped outside, the sharp night air hit Ethan like a slap. The city lights stretched out before them, glowing against the darkened skyline, but all he could think about was how out of place he felt standing beside Alexandra Whitmore. She had been laughing at something, a quiet, genuine laugh, the kind he hadn't expected from someone like her. But he barely heard it. His mind was still spinning from the dinner, from the luxury, from the reminder of just how far apart their worlds were. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" she asked, tilting her head, her blue eyes searching his face. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, except for the part where I had no damn idea what I was eating." she smirked. "I noticed. You looked personally offended when the caviar showed up." "Because caviar is just overpriced fish eggs," he shot back, shaking his head. "I don't get it. Most people pretend to like it because they think they're supposed to." "Yeah, well, I don't pretend." Something flickered in her expression. "I know." For a moment there was silence between them. She took a slow step closer, just enough for him to catch the faintest trace of her perfume. It was expensive, subtle, like everything else about her. "You don't belong in places like this, do you?" she asked softly. He let out a bitter laugh. "You're just figuring that out?" She studied him, and he could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she was searching for something. "Does it really bother you that much?" Ethan clenched his jaw, his pulse steady, but his thoughts anything but. It wasn't just the restaurant. It wasn't just the designer heels she wore, or the fact that she could probably buy his entire shop without blinking. It was the reminder that this, whatever this was, wasn't real. "This was fun, Alexandra," he said finally, voice low, steady. "But let's not pretend it means something it doesn't." Her expression flickered, barely, but he caught it, the crack in her confidence, the moment of hesitation. "You don't think this means something?" Ethan forced himself to look away. "I think we're two people from different worlds who had dinner. That's it." She took a step back, and for the first time she looked uncertain. "That's not all this is," she said quietly. He exhaled sharply. "I don't fit into your world, Alexandra, and you sure as hell don't fit into mine." Her arms folded across her chest, a slow inhale as if she was trying to compose herself. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away?" Ethan met her gaze, and for a second he almost hesitated. Almost. But then he thought about the Bentley, the penthouse, the way her life was built on a foundation he would never understand. "Yeah," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I am." He turned before she could say anything else, before the look in her eyes could make him question himself. His boots hit the pavement with heavy steps as he walked away, fists clenched, heart pounding. Alexandra stood frozen, watching him disappear down the sidewalk. People didn't walk away from her, not from her. And yet, for the first time in her life, it wasn't her money or her power that had been rejected. It was her. Ethan slammed the hood of the old truck shut, wiping his hands on a grease-streaked rag. The afternoon sun burned low in the sky, casting long shadows across the shop, but he wasn't paying attention to any of it. His mind was stuck somewhere else, somewhere he didn't want it to be. Alexandra. He had told himself he was done thinking about her, that walking away was the right call, that a woman like her, polished, powerful, untouchable, had no business being in his life, but no matter how many hours he spent drowning in engine repairs or burying himself in work, she still lingered in the back of his mind. And now she was reaching out. Again. His phone buzzed from the workbench. He didn't even have to look. He already knew who it was. "Alexandra, I shouldn't have let you walk away." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He should ignore it, should delete it and move on. Instead, his fingers hovered over the screen, his chest tightening at the weight of her words. She wasn't letting this go. "You going to stare at your phone all day, or are you actually going to do something about it?" Ethan looked up to see his sister leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with knowing eyes. "None of your business, Lacey," he muttered, shoving the phone face down on the bench. She smirked. "Right, because that wasn't the third time you picked it up in the last hour." Ethan groaned, tossing the rag onto the bench. "Let it go." Lacey stepped further inside, tilting her head. "So what's your plan? Ignore her forever?" "Pretty much." She let out a dry laugh. "You're an idiot." Ethan shot her a look. "You done?" "Not even close," she said, folding her arms. "You act like you've got her all figured out, but you don't, Ethan. You see, Rich. And assume that means she's just like all the others." "Because she is," he snapped. Lacey raised a brow. "Is she? Then why'd she track you down? Why didn't she just move on? Forget you ever existed?" Ethan said nothing, because he didn't have an answer for that. Lacey sighed, softer now. Not all rich people are bad, Ethan, and not everyone wants something from you. He clenched his jaw, staring down at the ground. Lacey shook her head. You're pushing her away because you're scared. Because if she's different, if she actually cares, you don't know what to do with that. Ethan swallowed hard, the truth in her words hitting deeper than he wanted to admit. Lacey took a step back toward the door, her voice quieter now. You can pretend she doesn't matter all you want, but if she's still in your head, she does. And with that, she walked away, leaving Ethan standing there in the empty garage, heart pounding, the fire still burning. A fire he couldn't put out. Ethan heard the Bentley before he saw it. The low, expensive purr of the engine cut through the quiet afternoon, a sound that didn't belong in a place like this. He knew she'd come back. He just didn't know when. The car rolled to a stop outside the garage, the contrast against the cracked pavement almost laughable. Alexandra stepped out, her heels clicking against the concrete, her coat draped effortlessly over her shoulders. She looked like she had stepped out of another world, because she had. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, sighing. You're persistent. I'll give you that. She walked closer, the usual confidence in her posture, but there was something else in her eyes. Determination. I have a proposition, she said. Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Of course you do. She didn't react to the sarcasm. I want to invest in something real, in you. His jaw tightened. I told you, Alexandra, I don't need your money. She didn't flinch. I'm not offering you a handout. I'm offering you a deal. Ethan exhaled sharply, tossing the rag onto the workbench. What kind of deal? Her gaze held steady. Your own garage, bigger, better. Your name on the sign. No more struggling to keep the lights on. No more worrying about whether you can afford rent next month. Ethan scoffed. And what do you get out of it? She tilted her head. Maybe I just want to see what you could do if you weren't always stuck trying to survive. He studied her, searching for the catch. There had to be one. Rich people didn't just throw money at people like him unless they were expecting something in return. Why? He asked finally. Why do you care? Her expression softened, just slightly. Because you're good at what you do. Because you help people even when there's nothing in it for you. And because I think you deserve more than this. Ethan clenched his jaw, looking away. It was tempting, too tempting. But people like him didn't take favors from people like her. It was a rule he had lived by his entire life. I can't, he said, voice low. Alexandra's eyes darkened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped closer. Think about it, she said softly. That's all I'm asking. And then she turned, walking back to her car, leaving him standing there with a storm raging inside him. By the time she drove away, Ethan knew two things. One, he wanted to say yes, and two, he was terrified of what it would mean if he did. The garage was quieter than usual, the usual clang of tools and hum of conversation replaced by something heavier, something unspoken. Alexandra stood near the workbench, her fingers trailing absently over a rusted old sign propped against the wall. The letters were faded, barely legible, but she could still make out the words. Carter's Auto Repair. Ethan hadn't spoken in a while, his back turned as he worked on an old Mustang, but she could feel the tension in his posture, the weight of something unspoken pressing against him. This was your dad's, wasn't it? She finally asked, her voice quieter than usual. Ethan stilled. For a moment she thought he might ignore her, might change the subject like he always did when things got too personal. But then he sighed, setting down the wrench before turning to face her. Yeah, he said simply. It was. She studied him, waiting. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He built this place from nothing, he said, glancing at the worn-out walls like he was seeing something she couldn't. Worked himself to the bone to keep it running. This garage, it was his whole damn life. Alexandra leaned against the workbench, watching him carefully. What happened? Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Same thing that always happens. A big company came in, opened a fancy new shop down the road. They had better equipment, corporate backing, all the things we didn't. And one by one his customers left. His voice tightened. He tried to hold on, but it wasn't enough. Alexandra felt something tug in her chest, a quiet ache she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry." Ethan shrugged, but there was something guarded in his expression. It's life. You either keep up or you get left behind. She could see it now, the reason behind his stubbornness, his refusal to take help. It wasn't just pride. It was fear. Fear of becoming dependent on something that could be taken away. Fear of losing something again. "You don't want my help because you think history will repeat itself," she said carefully. His jaw tightened. "I don't take handouts, Alexandra." "I'm not offering you a handout," she countered, stepping closer. "I'm offering you a chance to build something that lasts." For the first time, he really looked at her, not as a billionaire, not as some rich woman trying to play hero, but as someone who might actually understand. And that realization scared him more than anything. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garage floor, and the air inside was thick with the smell of metal and oil. Ethan was hunched over the engine of an old Chevy, his hands moving with a rhythm that came naturally to him. Each twist of the wrench, each turn of the screw, was deliberate, as if every part of the car, every detail, mattered to him more than anything else in the world. Alexandra stood in the doorway, watching him, the evening light filtering through the dust-filled air and catching the edges of his broad shoulders as he worked. She hadn't intended to stay. She'd just dropped by to check on the progress of the shop, but now she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from him. There was something about the way he worked, the way his focus never wavered, the quiet intensity in his every move. It wasn't just the car he was fixing. It was the way he poured himself into everything he did, his hands stained with grease, his brow furrowed in concentration. This was the kind of passion she had seen in the most driven people, the ones who didn't need anything but their own purpose to keep moving forward. She shifted her weight, stepping closer without even realizing it, captivated by the way his movements seemed to flow seamlessly, the way he lost himself in the task at hand. She had watched countless men work in her life, men who had money, men who had power, but none of them had ever done anything like this. None of them had ever put this much of themselves into something. Ethan's hands paused for just a moment as he looked up, catching her gaze from across the room. For a split second, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something that neither of them had been willing to address. "Need help?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. He shook his head, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a half-smile. "I'm good." There was a strange, almost magnetic pull in the way he looked at her, something that made her breath catch, something that sent a wave of warmth rushing to her chest. Ethan felt it too. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was there. The way her eyes seemed to linger on him, the way she didn't look at him like he was just some mechanic. It made him feel seen in a way he didn't understand, in a way he hadn't realized he craved. His hands shook slightly as he tightened a bolt, and he cursed under his breath, frustrated by the effect she was having on him. He had to focus, had to keep his head in the game. He couldn't afford distractions. But the longer she stood there, the more it felt like the world outside that garage didn't matter. It was just him and her. And for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like he had to hide from the things he wanted. Ethan's phone buzzed on the workbench, the sharp noise cutting through the quiet hum of the garage. He wiped his hands on a rag, looking up at the screen. The name didn't matter. It was the notification that caught his attention. Tabloid news. Billionaire heiress Alexandra Whitmore spotted with small-town mechanic. His stomach tightened. His thumb hovered over the screen as the headline stared back at him like a slap in the face. He wasn't stupid. He knew how the world worked, how people like Alexandra and the kind of life she led were always fodder for headlines. He had always assumed that was part of it. That's what came with being the heiress to a billion-dollar empire. But to see his name attached to it, to see it plastered next to hers like some kind of circus act, made something in his chest twist. A small-town mechanic, his name, his life, reduced to that. He wasn't a part of her world. He never would be. Alexandra hadn't said a word to him about it. He didn't need her to. He knew how this went. People didn't change. Not when money was involved. He tossed the phone onto the workbench, disgust simmering beneath his skin. He should have known. Should have known that someone like her would use him for some kind of feel-good story, the perfect rags to riches angle for a billion-dollar empire, the humble mechanic who had somehow caught the attention of a billionaire heiress. He had always been just a damn story. The door to the garage creaked open, and Alexandra stepped in, her silhouette framed by the fading light outside. She looked almost like an apparition, standing there in the doorway, but for the first time, Ethan didn't feel drawn to her. He felt repelled. "Ethan," she said, her voice tentative. "I need to explain." He cut her off, his voice harder than he intended. "No, you don't. I get it now." Her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" He couldn't look at her. He couldn't stand the way she was standing there, looking like she didn't know what was coming next. "You're using me, Alexandra. You don't have to lie about it. You were just looking for your next big story, your perfect little side project. I'm just a damn tabloid headline to you, aren't I?" Her face paled, the shock in her eyes cutting through him, but he couldn't stop now. His words were coming out like fire, each one a burn. "I'm not some charity case for you to parade around. I'm not your damn project." He turned away, slamming a wrench onto the table. "I don't need your help, your pity, or your damn stories." There was a long silence, the kind that felt like it stretched on forever. He could feel her presence behind him, but he refused to turn around, refusing to face her. Finally, she spoke, her voice small. "Ethan, it's not like that, but it was." It had to be. He could feel it in his gut, the heavy weight of everything he feared coming true. "I don't believe you." And just like that, he walked away. The phone call came an hour after the article leaked. Ethan knew it was her the second he saw the name flashing on his screen. He stared at it for a moment, his hand hovering over the device, before he swiped to answer, his chest tight with something he didn't want to feel. "Hey!" Alexandra's voice was hesitant, like she wasn't sure how to begin. "Don't!" He cut her off, his voice hard, the bitterness crawling up his throat. "I saw it, the article. I get it now." There was a long pause on the other end. "Ethan, please. It's not what you think." "No," he interrupted again, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've been thinking about this all day, all week. And you know what? I'm done. I'm done with this." "What are you talking about?" Her voice cracked with confusion, but he wasn't fooled. She had to know exactly what he meant. "I'm not your damn charity case," he snapped. "You came in here acting like you wanted to help, like you cared. But you're just like every other rich person, Alexandra. You've got your stories, your headlines, your little projects, and I'm nothing but one more thing to tick off your list." "No," she said, her voice shaking now, desperation creeping in. "You're not just a project to me, Ethan. You're more than that. I care about you. Don't!" he said sharply, his hand gripping the edge of the counter so tight his knuckles went white. "Don't do this! Don't act like you didn't know what you were getting into." "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I didn't want you to feel like that. I didn't think—" "Exactly, you didn't think," he shot back, his heart pounding in his chest. "You didn't think about me, about what it would mean, about how it would feel to be used for some damn headline." "I never used you," she whispered, almost pleading. "I never meant for it to be like this." He stood there, the silence on the line stretching out like a wound that wouldn't heal. "I can't keep doing this, Alexandra. I can't keep pretending like I'm someone I'm not, like I fit in your world. Ethan, please." "I'm cutting ties," he said, his voice raw, each word a punch. "I can't do this anymore." For a moment there was nothing but static on the other end of the line. He could almost hear her breathing, her heart breaking, and it made his own chest ache in ways he couldn't explain. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "Goodbye, Alexandra," he said, the words more final than anything he had ever said before, and with that, he hung up. The silence in the garage swallowing him whole. The clang of tools, the hum of the old machinery, it all felt distant, muted. Ethan found himself going through the motions, his hands working without thinking, tightening bolts and adjusting the engines, as if that would fix what had cracked inside him. But no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many hours he spent in the garage, the emptiness never left. It was the kind of silence that gnawed at him, filling every empty space in his mind. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was suffocating, and no amount of motor oil or grease under his nails could make it go away. He had told himself that cutting ties with Alexandra was the right decision, that it was better to walk away before he got hurt. But now, in the stillness of the garage, in the quiet of his small town where nothing changed, he felt more lost than he ever had. His phone buzzed on the workbench, dragging him from his thoughts. His sister Lacey's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. He didn't have the energy for another one of her lectures. But when he picked it up, her voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Ethan, we need to talk." "Not now, Lacey," he muttered, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm busy." "No, you're not," she replied, her voice sharp. "You've been hiding in that garage for days. You're avoiding the fact that you messed up." "I didn't mess up," he snapped. "I did what was best. I don't need her pity or her charity." "You don't get it, do you?" Lacey's voice softened, but there was an edge to it now. "You're pushing away the only person who saw you for who you really are. You're letting your pride get in the way of something that could actually make you happy." Ethan's chest tightened. "She doesn't care about me, Lacey. She's just using me for her story. She's not like that," Lacey interrupted, frustration creeping into her voice. "You're the one making it all about the money and the headlines. You're too scared to see that she wanted you, not the mechanic, not the rags-to-riches story. Just you." Ethan's breath hitched, his heart hammering in his chest. Lacey was right in some way. He had let his fear and his pride blind him to what had been right in front of him. "You're not the only one who's afraid, Ethan," Lacey continued, softer now. "But you need to stop running from the things that matter." He leaned against the workbench, the weight of her words settling over him. For the first time, he felt the hollow ache of regret claw at him. But he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to fix what he had broken. Alexandra sat at the edge of her bed, the soft glow of the city lights outside casting long shadows across the room. The penthouse was as silent as it always was at night, the kind of silence that should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Tonight it felt suffocating. Her gaze wandered to the window, to the sprawling city below, to the life she had worked so hard to build. She had everything anyone could ever want: wealth, power, the world at her fingertips. But in the quiet of the evening, in the absence of everything she had fought for, it felt hollow. Her phone buzzed beside her on the bed, a notification she didn't need to check to know what it was. Another business email, another deal to close, another task to tick off the list. She had spent so much of her life chasing things like this, chasing success, chasing validation, chasing anything that might fill the emptiness inside her. But none of it ever did. She thought about Ethan, his rough hands, the way he had fixed her tire in the pouring rain without asking for anything in return, the way he saw her, not as a billionaire heiress, not as a project, but as a woman, a person, something she hadn't felt in so long. When they were together, there had been no titles, no barriers between them, just two people who could see each other without the noise of the world around them. And she had let that slip away. The thought of him leaving, the look in his eyes when he walked away from her, still cut through her like a knife. She had always been the one in control, always been the one to make decisions, to shape the narrative. But with Ethan, she had been helpless. Helpless in a way that terrified her, because for the first time in her life, She had wanted something real, and now she was left with nothing but the remnants of a mistake. Was it worth it? Was it worth risking everything she had built for a chance at something real, something unguarded, something that might end in heartbreak? She wasn't sure. But the thought of a life without him, without that, without what he had made her feel, that was the thing she wasn't sure she could live with. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she could walk away from it. The city lights flickered in the distance as Ethan stood in front of the sleek, imposing doors of Alexandra's penthouse building. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted it to knock, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what he was doing. He had always been certain of his decisions, sure of himself in his own world. But standing here, at the threshold of her world, he felt small. He felt exposed. He had been avoiding her. He had kept his distance, convincing himself that walking away was the right thing, that it would protect him. But now, standing outside her door, he realized how wrong he had been. It was his pride, his fear, his insecurities that had kept him from seeing what was real. And now he had to face it. The door opened before he could knock again. And there she was, Alexandra. Standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise, but something else, something that made his heart ache, was there too. Hurt. "You came," she whispered, almost as if she couldn't believe it. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I shouldn't have walked away." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with all the things that had gone unsaid, all the mistakes they had both made. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I let my fear take over. I pushed you away because I was scared of what you'd see if you really got to know me." He paused, his gaze falling to the floor, then lifting back to hers. "I thought I wasn't enough for you, and I let that ruin something real." Alexandra's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you. I'm sorry I let my own shit get in the way of something that mattered." She took a step toward him, her gaze never leaving his. "Ethan," she started softly, but he interrupted her, finally gathering the courage to step closer. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice thick. "But I need you to know I see you. I see who you really are. Not your name, not your money, just you." The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't heavy with regret. It was full of possibilities. Alexandra reached for his hand, her touch tentative at first, then stronger as she pulled him closer. "I see you too," she whispered, "and that's enough." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan finally believed it. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, the warmth of Alexandra's apartment contrasting sharply with the cold night air outside. The penthouse was as immaculate as always, the polished surfaces gleaming under the dim light. But the space felt different now. Different in a way that he couldn't fully explain. There was no barrier between them anymore, not the walls he had built around himself, not the assumptions that had kept them apart. Alexandra sat across from him, her eyes soft, watching him carefully. She hadn't said much since he had arrived, since the apology that had seemed to break through some kind of wall between them. He could still feel the weight of everything they had left unsaid, lingering in the air between them. He shifted in his seat, the silence too thick to ignore. "You know, I didn't think I'd be back here," he said quietly, glancing at her. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again after everything." Her lips parted as she looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly, the air between them thick with the truth she had kept hidden. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced with all the things she could say, all the things he wasn't ready to hear. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself unable to make the words come out. Alexandra leaned forward, her hands resting in her lap as she steadied herself. "I didn't come to you because I needed a mechanic, Ethan." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't come to you because I thought you could fix my car." He frowned, confusion flickering in his chest. "Then why?" he asked, his voice low. "I came to you because I needed something real," she admitted, her eyes never leaving his. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who only see me for what I am, for what I have. But when I saw you, when I was standing there in the rain watching you help me without asking for anything, I realized that you were the first person to see me for who I truly was. Not the billionaire, not the heiress, just me." Her words cut through him like a blade. He hadn't realized how badly he had wanted to hear that, how badly he had wanted to be seen, really seen by someone who didn't have their own agenda. Ethan swallowed, the weight of everything pressing against his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but all he could do was stare at her, lost in the depth of what she was saying. "I don't need money, Ethan. I don't need a story or a project. I just needed to find someone who would see me without all of it. And you—" Her voice faltered for just a second before she continued. "You're the first person who did." His heart pounded in his chest. The truth hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded. And for the first time, Ethan understood. The walls he had built around himself, the assumptions, the fear, he could feel them all crumbling. And in that moment, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to be seen. Not by her, not by anyone. Ethan hadn't expected her to show up at the garage, but there she was, standing at the door, looking somehow different. Gone was the polished suit, the perfect makeup, the effortless elegance that had defined her every step. Instead, Alexandra stood in simple jeans, a worn-out jacket, and no makeup at all. She looked, for the first time, like someone he could recognize, a real person. He set down the wrench he was holding, confusion flickering in his chest. "Alexandra, what's going on?" She stepped inside, her eyes determined. "I'm here to prove something," she said, her voice steady, but carrying an edge he hadn't heard before. Ethan raised an eyebrow, unsure whether he should be worried or amused. "And what's that?" "I want to show you who I really am," she said, her words heavy with meaning. "I've been living in this bubble. My whole life has been this bubble. And I'm done pretending. For the next week, I'm going to live like a normal person. No fancy cars, no expensive dinners, no assistants. Just me, just someone who has to get by, like everyone else." Ethan stared at her, unsure how to respond, his gut twisted. "You're serious?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I need you to see me without everything that's always been between us, without the money, without the status. Just who I am." It wasn't just her words, but the way she looked at him, vulnerable, open, like she was laying herself bare, showing him a side of herself that she had never revealed. For the first time, Ethan saw the fear in her eyes. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice softer than before. "You don't need to prove anything to me." "I do," she insisted, "because I need to know that you see me for who I really am. Not for what I have, not for what you think I am. Just me." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always seen her as untouchable, someone who had everything, but in that moment, standing in front of him like this, he realized how much she had been hiding, how much of herself she had been willing to bury behind her wealth and her world. She wasn't just Alexandra Whitmore, the billionaire heiress. She was Alexandra, someone who had been searching for something real, something that wasn't tied to all the things she had been born into. And Ethan knew, in that moment, that the walls he had built for himself, the distance he had kept, had all been about his own insecurities. He had pushed her away, thinking she was something he could never have, something too far out of reach. But now, seeing her standing there, vulnerable, willing to throw away everything for him, he knew this was the moment that would change everything. "I see you," he said quietly, stepping closer. "I see who you really are." The rain fell softly against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the quiet between them. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his fingers drumming absent-mindedly on the mug in front of him, but he wasn't really paying attention to the coffee. He was watching Alexandra as she moved around the small, modest kitchen, her hands gently chopping vegetables, the same focus and care she had shown when she helped him at the garage. There was no pretense about her now, no walls, no facade. He hadn't known it before, but it was the simplicity of this moment that made him realize just how much he had been missing. Alexandra set the knife down and turned to face him, her expression soft but thoughtful. "I'm sorry I had to do all of this," she said, her voice low. "I know I made you uncomfortable with everything, with who I am, with what I have. But the truth is, I've spent my whole life proving something, proving I'm more than just my wealth. I didn't realize until now, I don't need to prove anything, not to you, not to anyone." Ethan looked at her, his heart tightening in his chest. He hadn't expected that, hadn't expected her to look so vulnerable. She wasn't just the woman who had everything anymore. She was the woman who had shown him how much more there was to life than the things we chase. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Alexandra," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I already see you for who you are. Not for what you have, but for the person you are. The person I want to be with." She looked at him, searching his face for sincerity, and when she found it, something in her eyes softened. "You don't think that's crazy? That someone like me, someone who's had everything handed to her, could be with someone like you?" Ethan shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "It's not crazy. It's real. You're real. And that's all I need." Her eyes shined with something unsaid, something deep before she closed the space between them, kneeling in front of him. "You're the only man who's ever looked at me like that," she whispered, her hand reaching out to gently touch his. "Like I matter. Like I'm worth more than just what I can offer." His heart ached with the weight of her words. He had always believed that people like him didn't belong in her world, that his worth was tied to what he could provide, to what he didn't have. But looking at her now, seeing the way she looked at him with such tenderness, he realized the truth that had been there all along. Money didn't define her, and it didn't define him either. It never had. Ethan pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke more than words ever could. It was a kiss filled with understanding, with the acceptance that neither of them needed to prove anything anymore, not to each other, and certainly not to the world. In that moment, all that mattered was them, together. And for the first time in his life, Ethan knew that this was the kind of love that couldn't be bought. It was the kind of love that came when two people saw each other for who they truly were and still chose to be together. Ethan sat across from Alexandra at a small, intimate dinner, the kind they had been having for weeks now. It was simple, take-out from the local diner, no fancy wine or glittering chandeliers. Just the two of them. It felt real, it felt comfortable, something that, a month ago, he never would have thought possible. But tonight was different. There was a weight to the air, an undercurrent that wasn't there before. He could feel it in the way Alexandra kept glancing at him, the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, the slight tension in her posture as she placed her fork down and cleared her throat. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about what you said, the idea of building something that's ours, something real." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "And I think it's time we take the next step." His heart skipped. Was she about to say what he thought she was? Had she finally decided that what they had was worth more than her world of wealth and status? But before he could let his mind wander further, she spoke again, her words hitting him with a force he hadn't expected. "I want to invest in you, in us, in something that will be ours, not just a piece of your past." He blinked, unsure he had heard her correctly. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "I want to help you build your dream garage, Ethan, not just the one you've been getting by with, the one you've always wanted, the one that's yours, that carries your name. I want to be a partner in this, a real partner, not just a financial backer, but someone who shares the vision with you. Let's build something together." Ethan's chest tightened. It wasn't what he'd been expecting. He had thought she might propose something romantic, some grand gesture of love and devotion. Instead, it was a business deal. But as he looked at her, at the sincerity in her eyes, he realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about something deeper. This wasn't just an offer. It was a new beginning. It was a chance for them to step into the future side by side, without the walls that had once held them apart. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, processing the weight of what she was asking. This wasn't just about a garage or a business venture. It was about trust. It was about building something real, something solid together. "You're serious?" he asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "More than ever," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm not asking for anything except to build this with you, to see what we can create when we stop hiding behind our fears." He didn't need more time to think, he knew. "I accept," he said, his voice firm, and a smile tugged at his lips. "Let's build something together." In that moment, Ethan realized that what they were about to build wasn't just a business, but a life he never thought he would have, but that he was finally ready to embrace. The sound of construction echoed through the empty lot, a rhythmic thud as the first bricks were laid for the new shop. Ethan stood in the center of the site, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, watching as the crew worked. His eyes traced every movement, every small detail of the process. This wasn't just a building rising from the ground. It was a dream coming to life. His dream. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't doing it alone. Alexandra stood beside him, her boots covered in dust, her hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. She had insisted on being there every day, her presence more than just financial backing. She was part of this, part of the vision he had once thought was impossible. "Looks good," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion, as he watched the crew move in sync, brick by brick. Alexandra smiled, but there was something different in her eyes now, something that wasn't just about business. She had been there with him from the beginning, pushing him to believe in himself when he doubted, giving him the courage to take the leap. "I think it's going to be even better than you imagined," she said quietly, her gaze on the workers, but her words directed at him. Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was somehow more than just the building of a business. It was the building of something real between them, something they had both been too afraid to name before. He stepped closer to her, his voice softer now. "I still don't know what I did to deserve this, to deserve you." Her eyes softened, and she reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his, grounding him in the reality of everything they had built together. "You didn't need to deserve it, Ethan. You just needed to be you." The weight of her words hung in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They just stood there, watching, as the foundation of his dream was laid in front of them. This was the beginning of something that would change everything for both of them. And for the first time, Ethan understood that this wasn't just about the garage, about the business. It was about the life they were building together, brick by brick, hand in hand. He wasn't alone anymore. They were doing this together. His dream garage wasn't just a place for cars. It was a place where his future, their future, was being forged. And with Alexandra by his side, he finally felt like he could build anything. The gala was held in one of the most exclusive venues in the city, a grand ballroom adorned with towering chandeliers and gold-accented walls. The kind of place where every guest was dressed to the nines and every conversation felt like a transaction. As usual, Alexandra was the center of attention, but tonight it felt different. The eyes that usually followed her with admiration were now filled with something colder, judgment. Her entrance hadn't gone unnoticed. She could feel the whispers behind her as she walked into the room, the murmurs that quickly grew louder as people turned their attention from their champagne glasses to the man beside her, Ethan. It had been a week since they had officially begun their project together, building the garage, creating something real. She had poured everything into it just like he had. They had been making progress, pushing boundaries, but now, standing in the heart of this glamorous world, everything felt fragile. Ethan wasn't supposed to be here, that much was clear. She could hear the snide remarks from her peers as they looked at Ethan, dressed in the only suit he could afford, clearly uncomfortable in the world that surrounded him. They didn't understand. They didn't see what she saw. To them, he was just another man from the wrong side of the tracks, a poor mechanic who had no place in her life. "He's not even your type, Alexandra," one of her oldest friends whispered, a venomous smile playing on his lips. "What's he doing here?" Alexandra's grip tightened around her glass, but she didn't flinch. She had spent too long listening to people who only saw her for what she could offer them, for what she could give. Ethan stood beside her, his eyes scanning the room, uncomfortable but unwavering. He didn't belong in this world, but he wasn't going anywhere, not without a fight. "I'm here because I choose to be," she said quietly, but firmly. The words fell between them like a challenge, and when she looked over at Ethan, his eyes met hers with a steady gaze, a promise. She had always been the one to fight for her place in this world, but tonight she realized Ethan was fighting for her too. He wasn't just the mechanic. He wasn't just a man who worked with his hands. He was someone who had earned her love, who had proven time and time again that his worth was more than the money that came with her name. As the night wore on, the comments continued, but this time Alexandra didn't feel the need to defend herself. She didn't have to prove anything, because she knew the truth. Ethan wasn't just the man she had chosen. He was the man who had shown her what it meant to love without pretension, to build something real without caring about the walls people tried to put between them. In that moment, as they stood side by side, the world watching them, she realized the most important thing. This, what they had, was worth fighting for, and she would fight for it, no matter what. The day before the grand opening, everything that had been built, the hours of planning, the sweat, the sacrifices, felt like it was hanging by a thread. The garage was ready. The sign was up. The first cars were scheduled to arrive, and Ethan and Alexandra stood together in the middle of the bustling space, the weight of their dreams pressing down on them. It was supposed to be a moment of triumph. But there was something gnawing at Ethan, something in the pit of his stomach that told him they weren't quite out of the woods yet. He had been working all day, making last-minute adjustments, when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He wiped his hands on his jeans and grabbed the phone, glancing at the screen. The name made his blood run cold. Carter Auto Solutions, a corporate rival, a company that had been gunning for this spot in the market for years, one that had tried to run his father out of business. He felt his jaw tighten as he picked up the call. "Ethan Carter," he answered, his voice hard. "We need to talk," a smooth voice on the other end said. It was Caleb Daniels, the CEO of Carter Auto Solutions, the man who had spent years trying to crush every small shop in the area with his endless resources. "You're opening a shop tomorrow, a shop that has no business being here. You're cutting into our territory." Ethan's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not cutting into anything. I'm doing what I've always done, taking care of people." "That's where you're wrong," Caleb said, the smugness clear in his voice. "We've already reached an agreement with the local suppliers. Your contracts are null and void. The parts you've ordered, they're not coming. Consider this a business lesson, Carter." The line went dead, and for a moment, Ethan just stood there, staring at the phone in disbelief. He felt the walls close in on him, the pressure rising. He'd worked too hard for this. They had worked too hard. "Ethan?" Alexandra's voice was soft, but there was a steel edge to it. She had been standing behind him, watching him as the conversation unfolded. "We've been sabotaged," Ethan said, his voice low. He turned to face her, the reality of the situation sinking in. "They've blocked all our supplies. They're trying to shut us down before we even open." Alexandra didn't flinch. "We're not going to let them win." Her words hit him like a shockwave. She was right. This was their moment. This was their chance. And they weren't about to let anyone, least of all Caleb Daniels, take it away from them. "We'll fight back," she said, walking to the desk where the contracts were laid out. "We've got leverage. We'll go to the suppliers directly. We'll show them the kind of business we're running. We don't need him, Ethan. We never did." Ethan felt a surge of hope flood his chest. With her by his side, he wasn't going to back down. They had built something real, and they were going to fight for it. Together. They spent the next few hours calling suppliers, making deals, and putting together a plan to bypass Caleb's manipulation. The pressure was intense, but the fire inside them only grew stronger. By the time the morning light broke through the windows, they had a plan in place. And when they opened the doors to the garage the next day, it wasn't just a victory for Ethan. It was a victory for both of them. The garage stood strong and unwavering because they had refused to let anyone tear it down. The day of the grand opening arrived with a strange kind of stillness in the air, a quiet before the storm. Ethan stood at the front of the garage, the doors wide open, the sun streaming in through the freshly cleaned windows. The place was ready, pristine, polished, and perfect. But it wasn't just the garage he was worried about. It was everything that came with it. The people who would come through those doors weren't just customers. They were eyes watching him, judging him, waiting for him to fail. He glanced over at Alexandra, standing next to him, her expression calm but determined. She was dressed simply, not in the expensive designer clothes he was used to seeing, but in a casual shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Still, there was no mistaking the quiet strength in her posture. She was with him. And together they were ready. The first car pulled up, and then another, and another, each one a new step towards something bigger than either of them had ever imagined. The crowd of people that had gathered in front of the garage was a mix of the usual local clientele and some who seemed out of place. Corporate faces, investors, critics who had come to see if the garage was really going to succeed or if it was just another failed venture. As they exchanged introductions and started to move into the garage, Ethan noticed the familiar faces of the people who had always doubted him, the ones who had called him just a mechanic, the ones who had rolled their eyes when he had started talking about the business he was going to build. They were standing at the back of the crowd, whispering among themselves, their eyes fixed on Alexandra and him. And then, just as the tension in the air seemed to reach its peak, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Did you really think you could just waltz into this world, Alexandra? With him?" Ethan's heart skipped. The words came from a woman in the back, one of Alexandra's high society friends, someone who had never thought he belonged in her world. Ethan could feel the heat of the eyes on them, the judgment. But before he could respond, Alexandra stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, calm and unwavering. She raised her hand slightly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Let me make something clear," she said, her words crisp, her tone strong. "I'm here with Ethan, because he is the man I believe in. He's the man who taught me that success isn't measured by money or status. It's measured by your character, your work ethic, and your ability to stand up for what you believe in." The room fell silent, all eyes now on her. Ethan could feel his chest tightening, but there was something in the way she stood there, unwavering and proud, that made him realize how much she had fought for this, for them. "I'm not here to prove anything to anyone," she continued, her gaze never leaving the crowd, but I will stand by him, and I will fight for what we've built, because this is real. This is worth fighting for." The room remained quiet for a moment before a few hesitant claps broke through, slowly gaining momentum. Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders as the tension in the air dissolved. In that moment he realized something he hadn't before. It didn't matter what anyone thought. He didn't need anyone's approval. What mattered was standing there with her together, unshaken. And as the crowd began to move toward the garage to take a closer look at the work they had done, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. They had built something that couldn't be torn down, not by anyone. They were ready, and they were in this together. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the new garage, the one they had built together. Ethan sat on the hood of an old car, the metal cool beneath him as he watched the light stretch across the quiet street. The bustling sounds of the grand opening had long faded, replaced by the peaceful hum of the evening settling in. The last few customers had trickled out, the doors now locked for the night. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Alexandra sat beside him, her legs stretched out in front of her, the weight of the day's triumph still lingering in the air between them. She looked at the horizon, but Ethan knew her thoughts were far from the sunset. She had come so far. They both had. They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that didn't need words. The wind rustled through the trees, the air heavy with the scent of the earth, and the city lights twinkled faintly in the distance. But none of it seemed as important as the moment they were sharing now. Alexandra shifted slightly, her eyes turning to him, the question lingering there as she broke the silence. "So, still think we're too different?" Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength in it, a challenge, like she already knew the answer. Ethan looked at her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. He had always been so focused on what made them different, the wealth, the world she came from, the walls that kept them apart. But now, after everything they had gone through, all the hurdles they had faced, all the doubts he had fought through, he realized just how wrong he had been. "Nah," he said, his voice low but steady. "Turns out we were always meant to be." Her eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She reached for his hand, their fingers brushing together, a small but meaningful gesture that said more than any words could. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, not because of the garage, not because of the success, but because of her, because they had fought for something real. And as they sat there, side by side, watching the last rays of sunlight slip away, they both knew this was only the beginning of something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. They didn't need anything else. They had each other. And that was all that mattered.